Okay, so now we're gonna look at Marlboro, and a couple of the themes that we talked about with respect to youth and the Canadian context will also reappear here with Marlboro. So Marlboro is actually an old brand, much older than probably people realize. The company that made Marlboro was called Philip Morris, which is today one of the largest tobacco makers in the world. Philip Morris was founded in 1902. And in 1924, they introduced Marlboro. And it was then a brand targeted to women. So this was at this time when women had recently got the right to vote in 1920. It was sort of seen as a kind of post-female suffrage brand that would target women, would sort of tap into their sense of desiring greater independence and political rights. Some of the things that we talked about before in the Canadian context as well. The tagline for the brand, mild as May. Another one was a cherry tip for your ruby lips. One Marlboro account manager at the time, this is in the 1920s, referred to the brand as being smoked mainly by women and some members of the gay crowd. So this was not the Marlboro Cowboy that we know of today, all right? Very different kind of brand, but very marginal in terms of its market share. Less than 1% of market share in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Many people didn't even know it existed, okay? Now, if you look at Marlboro and Philip Morris, so in the case of by 1960, Marlboro had somehow become the 6th largest brand in the country. By 1983, it's the #1 brand. Philip Morris by that time would control more than half of the U.S. cigarette market in terms of its powerful brands like Marlboro and Virginia Slims and Basic. Now, in marketing terms, sort of marketing history and advertising history, generally speaking, the Marlboro campaign that you know as the Marlboro Cowboy and the rest, is considered one of the most important advertising campaigns of the 20th century. When the trade magazine Advertising Age did their large survey of advertising professionals around 1999, and they asked them to rank the most important ad campaigns of the 20th century, #1 was Volkswagen, which we've talked about. #3 was Marlboro. All right. Now, it may be sad in some sense because it's cigarettes and it causes cancer, and hundreds of thousands, millions of people have died from being a Marlboro user, unlike, for the most part, being a Volkswagen driver. So the question is, we want to look at why this campaign was so hugely successful. We want to come up with an explanation for why the success of Marlboro was so stunning as it was, and of course how that would then reshape the cigarette industry in the United States and how it propelled Philip Morris into becoming a world dominant cigarette maker. Okay, so the historical context in some respects is similar to what we just talked about in the Canadian context with respect to the early 1950s. The cancer scare comes along. How do cigarette makers respond? In the case of Philip Morris, they thought, well, we've got to start putting filters on cigarettes to sort of alleviate the concerns that people would have. But what they also found was that there was a view amongst male smokers especially that a filter was something that was sort of effeminate, wasn't masculine. So how do you sort of square the circle, so to speak, in terms of putting filters on a brand and somehow create a brand that would still appeal to the masculinity desires that some male smokers would have? So Philip Morris did what those Canadian tobacco companies I talked about before did in the early 1950s. They did a ton of market research. And it's a point that really bears repeating. Oftentimes, now Volkswagen was not premised on market research, but other successful ad campaigns oftentimes can be. Okay, there's no right or wrong in terms of whether market research is needed in order to have a successful ad campaign. In this case, there was a lot of market research that was done. It was done by a market researcher named Elmo Roper. They did a large series of surveys. One was even 10,000 people. the largest ever survey of smokers, apparently. And they decided that they would try and reinvent the meanings of a filter from it being sort of a feminine thing to one that could actually be aligned with masculinity or rugged individualism. And so they introduced ad campaigns starting in 1954 that featured models in the ads. And you can see I've got a couple of them here that were smoking the cigarette. It had the filter on it. And they were particularly kind of virile, rugged, individual, masculine-looking guys. They featured guys with tattoos, sailors, hunters, pilots, mechanics, and even cowboys. But cowboys sort of comes later, right? They didn't start with the cowboy. Over time, they came to realize that the cowboy seemed to work best for them. During this campaign, sales grew. So they grew by about 4 times from 1954 to 62. So it's working, right? The idea that you can launch a new brand with a filter, again, you're dealing with that issue about some concern that people might have about cancer, but you don't have to make it a feminine kind of thing in terms of a branding strategy around filters. You could actually imbue it with masculinity and rugged individualism. Now, by the early 1960s, the Marlboro ads that featured the cowboy seemed to be working better, and they would be doing various types of testing to determine this as well. So then it comes back to that question we talked about before with respect to Jack Daniels and the identity myths and the rest. Why so, right? Well, one is the popularity of Westerns in the 1960s. The most important television shows at this time, shows like Wagon Train, Bonanza, Gunsmoke, are Westerns. There's lots of Western movies at the cinema in the 1950s and early 1960s. And in 1970, the U.S. government bans cigarette advertising on television. And so effectively, it pushes all of the bulk of the advertising budget for tobacco companies into print advertising, especially magazines, and even things like outdoor, like billboards. And these ads seem to work quite well in a print context. Sometimes an ad will work really well in a sort of television commercial context, and then may not be able to translate well in print because you can't really tell a story the way you can with a 30 or 60-minute ad. So they worked well in print. They evoked what we talked about before in terms of the gunfighter myth. We talked about it in terms of Douglas Holt and iconic branding. And there was a particular kind of appeal on the part of young men, teens, and then young men, that they seemed to respond to Marlboro advertising with the cowboy more so than they did with the Marlboro advertising that featured tough masculine guys with tattoos and the like. As one Philip Morris executive said when he was talking about the youth appeal of these ads, they scored very highly, as I said, with teens. And the teens, especially boys, because this is a very gendered brand as you get into the 60s, right? So it's primarily targeted towards boys and men. The themes of masculinity and independence resonate with those boys. And the cowboy is a particularly salient embodiment of that. As one Philip Morris executive said, the cowboy was a perfect symbol of independence and individualistic rebellion. Another said the cowboy has appealed to people as a personality. There are elements of adventure, freedom, being in charge of your destiny. Again, these are things that matter to you as a teen because you often feel that other people are controlling your life, parents, teachers, etc. So being able to latch on to a cultural symbol that seems to suggest you could be in control of your life, in control of your destiny, can be quite powerful. Marlboro's proved very successful in capturing teen boy smokers starting in the mid to late 1960s. And we'll come back to that in a second. One advertising executive referred to the Marlboro Man, again, the cowboy version of that, as the last free American. So teens, as I said, were very attracted to the Marlboro brand, male teens. What you found is that it starts in the early to mid 1960s. The brand, by the way, as I said before, by 1983, Marlboro becomes the #1 brand in the country. Much of that success by the 80s is driven by the fact that in the 1960s and early 70s, Marlboro was chosen by more than 50% of teen smokers. Okay? And what we talked about before was that they may not buy a lot of cigarette packs when they're teens because they don't have the money or their availability of smoking and that sort of thing. But it becomes their brand. They stick with it in their teen years, and they carry on with that brand in their 20 and 30-something years when they do have more time and money to become maybe a 30 or 40 cigarette a day smoker as opposed to a 10 or 15 days day cigarette smoker when they were 16 or 17. All right. These brands of independence and defiance of social and parental authority, the brand sort of connotes that very powerfully. And the testing that was done with these teens suggested that the brand's messaging, the symbolic communication, seemed to connect with them in terms of their own feelings of being overempowered or being sort of controlled by parents or by other social authority figures in their lives. Now, one of the changes that happens, if you look at the one I just had here, you can see there's the Cowboy, which is a focus on an actual cowboy-like figure, and then you've got Marlboro Country, right? And there was a transition starting in the 70s to more and more of the ads not being sort of close-ups of cowboys, but showing a cowboy and a large open expanse of society, right? Or sorry, not society, but of the of open expanse of the plains or the wilderness or something, the open prairie. So some have argued this is an embodiment of what's called the pastoral ideal, and this is an idea that's been around for quite a while from Leo Marx, and it basically suggests that people can sort of, if you're in a context of, say, an urban setting or some kind of complex institutional setting, there's a belief that somehow things are better if you escape that, right? If you get back to nature or you get back to the kind of pastoral notions of openness and being at one with animals or nature, whatever the case may be. And so there is a context too in the 70s, for example, in the United States. There are race riots. There are demographic changes in cities where white people are leaving urban areas. African Americans are moving to urban areas. There's a kind of white flight to get away from that. There's segregation, residential segregation that's happening. There's protests against the Vietnam War, etc. So cities were becoming more and more difficult places in terms of the social unrest that was existing there. And so there was this larger belief that if you could just get away from it all and in those open spaces, things would be better. And you can see that the Marlboro Country ads, because they exalt both an image of the cowboy, so you have that aspect of rugged individualism and even masculinity, but you also have this open expanse where somehow you can escape the problems that might be surrounding you. Now, they didn't, increasingly in the Marlboro Country ads, you don't really see a real kind of cowboy depiction, sort of up close and sweaty and maybe dirty or something like that. It's more of a mythical representation of a cowboy, right? It's a symbol of what some have called a kind of irretrievable innocence that's linked to this pastoral idea. And interestingly enough, if you look at these Marlboro ads and your first thought might be, well, I'll bet you that brand sold better in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. In fact, it was the opposite. Marlboro was more successful in cities than it was in small towns and rural areas, and for the reasons that I just described. And of course, there are also more young people, teens, that would be living in cities or suburbs. Now, you can take this idea from, you can look at the notion of Marlboro Country and even extend it to a larger idea of kind of corporate freedom, the ability of corporations to market their goods without any restraints from government or other types of social organizations. One of the points you can make about Marlboro Country as it's represented in advertising is there are no authority figures there, right? There's no parents, there's no older brothers, there's no bullies, there's no teachers, and there's no sheriff in Marlboro Country, right? There's no actual authority figure there. And that can be a very powerful message beyond just what I've talked about in terms of teens, young male teens, in terms of them seeking independence in their lives. You could take this theme and you can apply it to a kind of independence from governing authority, independence from state regulation. What's happening to tobacco companies, especially in the 60s and especially in the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s, is that they are increasingly concerned about the government, the US government or the Canadian government in Canada, increasingly concerned about them putting more and more restrictions on cigarette marketing and advertising and sales. The governments did some things. They put package warning labels on packages, and they banned cigarette advertising on television, for example, because they thought too many young people would see those ads. So in that sense, these ads kind of do, they have a dual purpose almost, right? They work well in terms of communicating with those teens and young men who want that sense of rugged individualism, want that sense of independence, but they also can connote a kind of larger political message, right? About libertarianism, about being free, being independent, not having authority figures around you, not having state regulation, and that sort of thing, and keeping it going. The other thing, too, is that they can also promote a sense of skepticism or distrust of forms of social institutions like medical science, for example, right? Medical science at this time is increasingly saying that smoking will cause cancer. It's also saying that the secondhand smoke from smoking can cause cancer too for those people who are exposed to that for long periods of time. So it's in the interests of tobacco companies to have a kind of political ethos existing that people just become skeptical of authority, right? Skeptical of authority figures and experts and these sorts of things. If you want to think about where it resonates today, think Trump, right? I mean, he's very much an embodiment of this type of thinking. So it leads to, it's advertising that works well from the standpoint of product marketing, but it also works well in terms of a larger public relations kind of, or almost even a propaganda kind of model, where you're creating a sense of political understanding of the relationship between government and corporations, and that relationship should be one of government having minimal interference in the working lives of corporations. And finally, you can go back to the point we talked about with Douglas Holt and the iconic branding, and the point that he made, that iconic branding is of course latching onto a myth, right? Of course, this cowboy myth we talked about in the context of Jack Daniels and that. And so the point that he does make, Douglas Holt, is that this type of advertising is inherently conservative, right? It performs a conservative function, since myths, effectively like this, they naturalize the status quo, containing otherwise destabilizing changes in society, so that social contradictions are then transformed into cultural symbols and identity myths. And that social and political problems, whether in the US or Canada, they get managed through myth-making and consumption rather than through democratic debate. Okay? So Marlboro Man and Marlboro Country were rooted, on the one hand, in marketing practice. I mean, the manifest function, the most pressing function, the one that sort of gets it started, is one of trying to recruit and retain consumers for this brand. And for that, the brand was enormously successful, not just in the U.S. too. By the way, the Marlboro Man and Marlboro Country themes now resonate worldwide, especially in the developing world, in terms of the success of Marlboro and that type of advertising. But the latent function is what I've been talking about in the last couple slides. And that's the idea of Marlboro Country as a space of personal independence, freedom from social control, which in turn supported Philip Morris's ideological mandate to ensure or to lobby for minimal state regulation and low taxation for a product that was being shown by modern science to be lethal. All right. Okay, so that's it for today, and I'll chat with you guys on Tuesday. Take care.